Good evening. My name is Troy Osborne, and I am Dean at Conrad Grebel University College. I am pleased to welcome you to the 2021 Benjamin Eby Lecture. This is the 33rd installment of a lecture series that offers Grebel faculty an opportunity to share their ideas with the wider community, making accessible the fruit of their research, and thereby hopefully inspiring each other towards a larger vision of the mind and spirit. The series is named after Benjamin Eby, an early bishop and educator in the Mennonite community of Upper Canada in the 1800s. It was Eby and a few people of similar stature who set the course of life in Waterloo County in the first half of the 19th century. Eby promoted education among the group descended from the Mennonites from Pennsylvania who purchased 60,000 acres of land, Block 2 of the Haldimand Tract, in 1805. The college and the University of Waterloo are built on the traditional territory of the Arawandron, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. This land was given in treaty in 1784 to the Six Nations, and that includes 10 kilometers on each side of the Grand River. As we work on building relationships with our Indigenous friends and neighbors, we at Grebel are educating ourselves and working to change our understanding of the narrative of our place. Understanding settler and Indigenous encounters is one of the themes of this evening's lecture, and it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's lecturer, Dr. Karen Sunabacka, Associate Professor of Music at Grebel. A composer with deep roots in Manitoba, Karen explores the beauty and winds of the prairies, as well as the intersection of her settler and Indigenous heritage in her music. Her compositions have been performed in Canada, the USA, Brazil, and the United Kingdom. She has recently written works for the Orchestre Métropolitain in Montreal, the Winnipeg Symphony Orchestra, Park Sounds, and choirs here at Grebel. In February 2018, Karen was a finalist for the 21st Prix Opus in the category Composition of the Year for the piece De Natura Sonorum, which was commissioned by the Orchestre Métropolitain. Karen won the Canadian Music Centre Prairie Region Emerging Composers Competition in February 2009 with her orchestral composition, And There Was a Great Calm. Karen is an active member and past board member of the Canadian New Music Network, and she is a board member for Groundswell, Winnipeg's new music series. She founded Pressure Waves in Winnipeg, which is now a regular part of Groundswell's Emerging Composer Program, and Numus, Kitchener-Waterloo's new music series. At Grebel, Karen teaches music theory and composition courses and is known for her commitment to her students' success and well-being. While balancing teaching, composing, and performing, Karen says that she still keeps up with the latest science fiction and fantasy book, film, or television series. Karen is a gifted composer and teacher and a good friend, and we are very happy to have her as a colleague. Thank you, Karen.
Tanse, Karen Nitsikason, Winnipeg, Kayate Ochenia, Joyce Clouston, Nikawi, Lenore Burston Klusten, Nokam, Katochakewin, Nikiskin Wahamakan, Ki Chikiskin Wahamatu, Wakamikok, Conrad Grebel University College, University of Waterloo. I am a member of the Manitoba Métis Federation, and I grew up in Treaty 1 territory, the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Innuak, Anishinaabe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. When I moved to Waterloo a little over 4 years ago, I knew very little of the Haudenosaunee people. I am honored to have learned from and collaborated with a number of Haudenosaunee people and been welcomed at the Woodland Cultural Center and the Mohawk Chapel. I still have a lot to learn about this area, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Indigenous peoples who took care of this beautiful land for thousands of years. I hope to grow these relationships and knowledge as I continue to live here in what is now known as Kitchener-Waterloo, Ontario. I have always known I was a Red River Métis, but I haven't always known what that means. In the last 10 years, I have been doing a lot of exploring and learning about my family history in the Red River settlement and what it means to have a mixed European and Métis heritage. These explorations often occurred first through my compositions and then through research and family conversations that grew into more compositions as my curiosity led me to new revelations. To take you through these explorations, I have divided my talk into 3 parts. The first looks at the 3 pieces I have written about my Métis grandmother, Lenore Klusten. It is thanks to her that I knew I was Métis, and it is through explorations of her life in my compositions that I have discovered more about what it means to be Métis and learned more about the history of the Métis people. In this first section, I will also talk about how my collaborations with my mom, Joyce Clouston, began. The second part looks at a piece I wrote about my settler heritage, and it is on the theme of mental illness, and specifically about my great-great-grandmother, Matilda Klusten, who moved to the Red River settlement around 1866 and spent the final 25 years of her life in the Manitoba asylum. In the third section, I will be discussing 2 recent pieces about my Aunt Beverly, which were both inspired by the writings of my mom. The first piece I wrote that explicitly taps into my Métis heritage began as a celebration of my Métis grandmother, Lenore Klusten. The piece, for string orchestra, titled Born by the River, was commissioned and premiered by the Manitoba Chamber Orchestra in February 2013. My grandmother was a farmer, visual artist, and local Selkirk community activist. She came of age during World War II when her own family's Indigenous roots were hidden. Her grandparents both spoke Cree, but this was not talked about. Through her art, she explored her multicultural past so that her children and the following generations could be proud of their heritage. My grandmother's hospitable Métis family was the center of the community, and so my Scottish settler grandfather, who lived in the area, often gathered with the other youth at my great-grandparents' farm. It was there that he learnt to play the fiddle. As a child, I spent much time at my grandparents' farm near Selkirk, where the tradition of music making and community gathering continued. My grandmother would sit at the piano, laying the foundation for the pieces, while my grandfather played the fiddle. I remember dancing the night away with my siblings as the music twirled around us, hearing the constant presence of my grandmother singing and laughing as she banged the chords out on the piano. For a few years, I also learned some fiddle tunes myself and played with my grandparents. For this reason, it is a fiddle tune that is the background of this piece, and it is the first time I used a fiddle tune in my music. The tune shows up in fragments and is the major rhythmic pulse throughout the work. The other musical material in the piece comes from my grandmother's first name, Lenore. I divide the letters of her name into 3 syllables, le, no, re. Then I interpreted these 3 syllables as the pitch A flat, a pizzicato note with silence, and the pitch D. This motive is both in the larger structure of the piece and in the foreground as small 3-note motives. During the Depression, the land developed by my great-grandparents was illegally repossessed, and her family lost their plot near Selkirk and moved a mile west. Yet the Red River and the old family homestead continued to be an important source of artistic inspiration for my grandmother. Because of my grandmother's love for the Red River, Born by the River also depicts the water's movement through constant rhythms and the quick rise and fall of pitch patterns. The piece is also composed around the idea of fuzzy memories. Although the fiddle tune around which the piece is based represents the river, I also use it to depict a memory that comes in and out of focus. So there are times in the music when everything seems off. But then for a moment, all voices come together perfectly, but that only lasts for a few seconds, and then the clarity fades. This depicts my own memory of playing the old French, the tune I use in this piece, with my grandparents. And you can hear this in the following excerpt. Before I continue, I thought it was important to make sure everyone understands the definition of Métis. Growing up, I thought Métis meant people with mixed European and Indigenous heritage. But I was wrong about this. I was close to my Métis family, and although I grew up in Winnipeg, we visited the family farm at least once a month. And anyone I met with mixed heritage was Métis. But of course they were. We were in the Red River settlement. As I started meeting Indigenous peoples from across Canada, I realized that there was a unique identity specific to my family and the Métis centered in the Red River settlement. So who exactly are the Métis? If we translate this French word, it basically means mixed. The Cree word for Métis is Apitawiko Sisan, which means half of the people, or Otipeyemisoak, which means the people who command themselves, or independent people. And the word my ancestors were called, because my family heritage is English and Indigenous, was half-breed. But that doesn't tell us who the people are and how they became the Métis Nation. If you have been following the news recently, you may have heard that the Manitoba Métis Federation has recently left the National Métis Council. A major part of this disagreement is over the definition of who is and who is not Métis. In the press release about the withdrawal, the president of the Manitoba Métis Federation, David Chartrand, says, and I quote, "This decision to leave was not an easy one. We asked our 2019 Annual General Assembly to give us the direction to pull out of the Métis National Council should the Métis Nation of Ontario continue to be allowed a seat at the governance table, while they, by their own admission, have nearly 80% non-Métis Nation citizens in their registry. Our assembly of 3,000 delegates unanimously supported the resolution. We feel compelled to protect and support those who derive their Section 35 rights from the Red River Métis, also known as the Manitoba Métis, which is the origin, heart, and core of the Métis Nation." End quote. The Section 35 rights Chartrand is referring to is Section 35 of the Constitution Act from 1982 that states, 1, the existing Aboriginal and treaty rights of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada are hereby recognized and affirmed, and 2, in this act, Aboriginal peoples of Canada includes the Indian, Inuit, and Métis peoples of Canada. So again, who are the Métis? The definition of Métis that was adopted by the Métis Nation in 2002 comes from Article 3 of the Manitoba Métis Federation Constitution, which is defined as follows, and I quote, Métis means a person who self-identifies as Métis, is of historic Métis Nation ancestry, is distinct from other Aboriginal peoples, and is accepted by the Métis Nation. End quote. The rest of the definition that you can see on the slide essentially defines the first line. So in summary, to become a member of the Manitoba Métis Federation, you must first self-identify as Métis, second, prove that you have Métis ancestry, and this is often proven through records of who was given scrip, and three, be an accepted member of the Métis community. I completed the application with my brother in 2017, but my mom and a number of her siblings had their Métis cards for years. In 2015, a few years after I completed Born by the River, I was commissioned to write a piano quintet for the Agassiz Chamber Music Festival. This gave me the opportunity to write a second piece about and inspired by my grandmother Lenore. I called this piece Mama's Painting, Louis Riel's Dream. And this is because when my Métis grandmother was in her 50s and 60s, she started a large project she called Louis Riel's Dream. She began with 5 sketches that she intended to turn into 5 paintings. These paintings were to highlight the history of Western Canada through the stories of Indigenous peoples, illustrating the clashes of cultures and politics in what is now known as Western Canada, and pointing to a future where people of all races could live in harmony. My grandmother never finished this project, and all that remains are 2 unfinished paintings. The painting used to promote this event is the first of these paintings. Because I was so compelled by my grandmother's project, her artwork, and her inspiration from Louis Riel, I decided to complete her art project musically. I sought collaboration with members of my family, using the prose of my mother to start each of the 5 movements of the piece, and inviting my sister Andrea and aunts Lisa and Lana to contribute artworks to display at the concert. The premiere was a wonderful and collaborative event. Composing the piece was a musical completion of my grandmother's 5-painting plan. It was another celebration of my grandmother, but it was also an exploration of my grandmother's struggles with her identity and a glimpse at the history of the Red River settlement. The following excerpt is from the end of the 2nd movement and into the beginning of the 3rd movement, with text by my mother, Joyce Clouston. My parents were strict Anglicans, Mama says. I hated going to church. We girls had to wear a hat in church. Mom and Dad drove 5 miles with a horse and buggy, winter and summer, snowstorm or not. They established St. Matthew's in Cloverdale, raising money by playing baseball and holding dances in the local hall. And my mother forced us to wear hats outside in the summer too. Wear a hat, always wear a hat. We used to laugh at her. We all joked that she must have been scared by an Indian. Then, everywhere I went during the war, at every station, people said, "You must be part Indian." I replied, "I don't know," and I didn't. I went to the archives. I found out that the women of the family were called Indian women. Men had names, Scottish names, but the women were nameless.
Do you realize that I can go to Sweden and find my mother's ancestors by their names? And your dad can go to Scotland and find his ancestors, and to England to find his mother's ancestors? And I can go to the Orkneys and find the first male ancestor in my father's family from 1790 when he joined the Hudson's Bay Company? But the woman had no names, they had no faces. They were Swampy Cree. I know that now, but I found it in the archives, and I can't go anywhere in this country to find out where my ancestors, the woman, were from. My mother was Swedish, and she was the first white woman in the family in 5 generations. She was ashamed of us. She was prejudiced. She insisted my father was Scottish. But look at him. Look at his picture. He looked like Chief Pontiac. So Mama drew the woman, their faces, beautiful faces, emerging out of darkness.
This piece is the first time I collaborated with my mum. Her writing is deep and personal, and I was thirsty for more information about our family and how we fit with the larger Métis community. But after writing the piece and engaging with my mother's writings and her memories of my grandmother, I couldn't stop asking these questions. Why was it that my grandmother did not know she was Métis? And why was her mother so determined to tell everyone that her husband was Scottish? I figured a lot of this had to do with racism towards the Métis. But recently I read Jean Taillet's book, The Northwest is Our Mother, and have a better understanding of why my ancestors actively worked to hide their heritage. When the Manitoba Act was signed in 1870 and Manitoba became part of Canada, an expeditionary force from Ontario was sent to the Red River settlement. This force was led by John Christian Schultz, a member of the Canada First movement, a movement that, among other things, believed in Anglo-Saxon superiority. Schultz was active in the Red River settlement before 1870, was the founder of the Canada First branch in the Northwest, and was not a friend of the Métis. In her book, Taillet writes, and I quote, "There were over 10,000 people in Red River when the expeditionary force arrived. 8,000 were fairly evenly split between English and French Métis. But the arrival of the troops, just over 1,000 men, established the emotion that was to dominate the population for the next 2.5 years: fear. The expeditionary force was readily available to carry out the revenge envisioned by the Orange Lodge. One of Schultz's supporters summed up their goal: the pacification we want is extermination. We shall never be satisfied till we have driven the French half-breeds out of the country." End quote. So in the 1870s, the social environment of the Red River settlement that had been about cooperation and consensus changed, with many political white settlers enforcing a reign of terror on the Métis who remained in the Red River settlement. For my ancestors, there was racism within the family, but they could say they were English or Scottish. For the French Métis, it was much worse. They were Catholic and Métis. And the new settlers and military men gathered and fired up through a propaganda campaign by Schultz and others, tended to be Orangemen from the Orange Lodges of Ontario. My ancestors were able to continue working on their farms north of Winnipeg. They were in their English parishes, and they were able to stay, for the most part, out of the line of fire. The area along the Red River, North of Winnipeg was where a majority of the English Métis had held their properties since the early 1800s. However, they were still affected by the way the Government of Canada chose to interpret the Manitoba Act. The original farms of the Métis in all parts of the Red River settlement were built on ribbons of land or rangs along a river. Taillé writes, "The Métis built their homes on the rivers, on long, narrow lots they called rangs. The rangs were about 800 feet wide and about 2 miles long. Each family built their home and garden fairly close to the river. Toward the back of their rang, they had a commons that provided forage lands for their livestock, their hay privilege, woodlots, and other cutting areas." End quote. This slide shows how the land was developed. This is a survey map from around 1870, and the Burston family farm was just a little to the north, or on the picture to the right, of the Hudson's Bay Company fort, what we now call Lower Fort Garry. In this next slide, if you look at the land today from above, you can still see this organization in the Google Terrain map. I took this map from Google. The land still carries the memory of the rangs. When the Canadian government half-heartedly attempted to fulfill the Manitoba Act, they gave the Red River Métis something called Métis or half-breed scrip. According to the Canadian Encyclopedia, and I quote, "In 1870, the Canadian government devised a system of scrip referred to as Métis or half-breed scrip that issued documents redeemable for land or money. Scrip was given to Métis people living in the West in exchange for their land rights. The scrip process was legally complex and disorganized. This made it difficult for Métis people to acquire land, yet simultaneously created room for fraud." End quote. The land assigned to my ancestors through scrip was not anywhere near their community around Selkirk, so they had to repurchase their land along the river, with the next generation purchasing other land available on what had been their shared pasture lands. According to the Manitoba Act, they should have been granted that land. Then, as I mentioned earlier, their purchased land was illegally removed by a large profit-making corporation during the Depression. So in summary, the Burston family, my Métis ancestors, lost land in 2 generations. The politics of early Manitoba was so much about who did and who did not get land. And so I want to return one last time to the current concerns of the Manitoba Métis Federation. There is a fight, and it relates to our Canadian history, the land, and the relationship between the Métis and the Canadian government. In 2003, there was a case brought to the Supreme Court of Canada called R versus Pauley that held that there was a Métis rights-bearing community in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. This case was successful in all levels of court. Unfortunately, this opened the door to people in the East, Ontario and Quebec, claiming to be Métis. These new Métis claim that because they have a many times great Indian grandmother, they are Métis. There has lots been written about this, and I could point you to a number of scholarly articles, but what I want to say today is that this is a threat to the Métis, to the Red River Métis, and our rights. As the arguments were escalating between the Manitoba Métis Federation and the Métis National Council, a message from President David Chartrand was sent on August 19, 2021, to the members of the Manitoba Métis Federation. And this points to just how serious this issue is. And I quote, "Not since the days of Louis Riel have we had so much to lose with so many wanting to take what we have? Make no mistake, friends, we have a fight on our hands, and it's no different from the fight we had at Frog Plain, at Upper Fort Garry, or at Batoche. There are people from the East who are coming to take what we have, and once again, it's up to us to decide whether or not they succeed." End quote. So the Red River Métis are again being threatened from the East. As I become more familiar with the larger issues in our political landscape and issues facing Indigenous peoples in what is now Canada, I am struck by how often history repeats itself and how in Canada we seem to be going in circles. The Red River Métis are continuing to fight in court about the mishandling of the Manitoba Act, saying that it is a treaty and the Canadian government failed to provide the Métis with the land grants they were promised. The Supreme Court agreed in 2013, but the negotiations continue. So, when my grandmother, Lenore Klusten, was coming of age, she didn't know about her connection to the Métis. She was deeply connected to the land and the community in which she was raised because her father and grandfather chose to stay in the community, purchasing land that should have been granted to them from the Manitoba Act and repurchasing land that had been in the family for close to 100 years. After experiencing this loss of land, her father, Alexander Burston, who was a Métis leader in the community, insisted that all his children get a good education. His reasoning was that once you had an education, it couldn't be removed, and you could defend yourself against swindlers. Many of his children became teachers, many of his grandchildren have graduate degrees, and many of his great-grandchildren, myself included, have PhDs. I missed meeting my great-grandfather by only a few years. I wish I could have met him. With each new piece I've written about my grandmother, I've gone deeper into her life and her relationships. In 2018, I was commissioned to write a piece for Park Sounds, a newly formed viola and percussion duo whose members are old friends Jen Thiessen and Ben Reimer. And as I was starting to write this piece, my mother was starting a book about her childhood, and in particular about her relationship to her older sister. She sent me a chapter to read, and in it, I discovered another side of my grandmother, a young, artistic woman who wanted to go to art school, but whose life abruptly changed during and after the war. With the help of my mom, we edited the text to a kind of monologue that depicts my grandmother's or my grandparents' relationship and struggles before and after the Second World War. The piece is titled, "I Wasn't Meant for This," and was premiered in October 2019. The following is part of the opening movement.
If it wasn't for your sister, I'd have never stayed, Mother said. Never a moment to yourself when you're a mother, she said. I'd have never stayed here. I was stuck when she came. When I knew she was coming, she said. dilly-dally. Everyone helps on a farm. I wasn't meant for this, she said, to be a farm wife. You don't know what a person's like until you live with them, she said. I learned that when we lived with his parents, before we got our own house.
The piece moves from my grandmother's disappointments of early motherhood on the farm and the racism she experienced of her in-laws into her relationship with her husband, my grandfather, and the love they had. The middle movement is based on a fiddle tune and recalls their experiences at community dances when my grandfather was fiddling in the band. And the final movement recalls the struggles after the war and dealing with my grandfather's PTSD. Their relationship was difficult. There were times when the deep Indigenous-based values of my grandmother's family clashed with my grandfather's. But my grandfather was also drawn to my grandmother and her family and found healing there. They had a beautiful, difficult, and complicated relationship. My grandmother was resilient. There was a long time where she was raising kids and shouldering the farm work, while her husband was working at the local steel mill and farming around the shift work. But she also found time to develop her art and research her heritage. Then, when she was in her 50s and her children were mostly grown and independent, she finally attended university, enrolling in the Fine Arts program at the University of Manitoba, graduating in the late 1970s. So many of my memories of her are in her studio at the farm, working with stained glass or behind an easel or weaving on her loom. She was producing art right up until the day she died. When visiting the family farm, we often heard stories about the community and our ancestors. The most heartbreaking of these stories was about Matilda Klusten, who is from the settler side of my family, my grandfather's family, the Klustens, who came from Orkney. Many of my Métis ancestors worked at the Manitoba Asylum, now known as the Selkirk Mental Health Center, and they knew Matilda from there. My grandfather, Jack Klusten, was her grandson. My mother's Métis family said she suffered because she didn't have community. I decided to explore Matilda's story for a second piece that I was commissioned to write for the Manitoba Chamber Orchestra in 2013. At the time, I was dealing with my own closeness to mental illness as I watched my mom struggle with situational depression. By 2013, my mom was recovering, much to the relief of all of us, and to deal with my own feelings of helplessness and anger about the situation, and to try to understand the life circumstances that can lead to mental illness, I explored Matilda's story through my music. Matilda was born in Kirkwall, Scotland, on the Orkney Islands in 1847. She married Joseph Clouston, an employee of the Hudson's Bay Company, who had traveled back and forth between Orkney and Lower Fort Garry before their marriage. He brought his new bride back to what is now Canada with him in the late 1860s to settle in the Red River settlement. Life was hard for Matilda. The Red River settlement was likely a rough and scary place for her. All her family was in Orkney. In one particularly difficult and disease-stricken winter, 2 of Matilda's children died. Unable to dig into the frozen ground, her husband Joseph wrapped the bodies and placed the children in the woodshed. Feeling isolated and alone, Matilda was unable to cope with this loss. She went out to the woodshed and brought her deceased children back into the house, warming them by the fire, insisting they were not dead. Joseph would then bring the children back to the woodshed. After this happened a number of times, Joseph committed her to the Manitoba Asylum, where she would spend the rest of her life. She lived at the Manitoba Asylum from around 1887 to 1912. Never to Return explores Matilda's life through 3 Scottish melodies and is a kind of lament, the cry of Matilda, whose mind was broken by the loss of her children. Her loss and sacrifices gave me life. Her story is part of my story and our Canadian story. Giving voice to her pain, her suffering, and to her sacrifices is a way for me to reconcile her story with my own and the history of the early Manitoba settlers. I will play for you the end of the middle section where there is a transition from the trauma of loss into a more hopeful section focused on healing. I based the final section on a Scottish hymn, actually a well-known Scottish traditional melody titled Ye Banks and Braes. But I found an arrangement by John Bell and Graham Mole with the words, "We cannot measure how you heal." And I thought it was particularly pertinent to Matilda's story. The reception to this piece was surprising. Even before the premiere, I had long-lost relatives who were also descendants of Matilda contact me and my family with their own stories of mental illness and generational trauma. And hearing these stories was devastating. Many had tried to run from the trauma and abuse that was a result of Matilda's illness. They had no idea that there had been mental illness and trauma in the family. I am grateful to my Métis family because of the values and the traditions we had of sharing stories and caring for each other during difficult times. I heard our family stories often growing up, giving me a context and an openness about the difficulties of life. I also knew that I had ancestors who faced difficulties, and I knew I could talk with family and be supported when I was struggling. The strength within the Métis community lies in its core values of sharing and caring towards all. So although my grandfather's family looked down on their half-breed neighbors, it was the traditions and values of my Métis grandmother's family that helped my grandfather thrive. The final two pieces I wish to present are about my Aunt Beverly Klusten and were again inspired by the writings of my mom, Joyce. As I mentioned before, my mom has been writing a book about her relationship with her sister. My mom is the third child in a family of 7 children. Her oldest sister, Beverly, suffered a birth injury and became physically disabled around age 6. Beverly lived with seizures and with developmental and physical disabilities. She lived in an institution for 28 years. When group homes were made available for people with disabilities, she moved into a community home where she was loved and respectfully treated. She stayed with us regularly and always asked how we were doing, and always brought us cards and gifts she had carefully chosen. Her generosity, warmth, and enthusiasm filled my childhood home every time she came. She died in April 2016, a week or so after my mom and I had visited her. Her joy at seeing me still brings tears to my eyes. So when I started working on an English horn concerto in 2018, I decided to dedicate it to my Aunt Bev. I incorporated her favorite songs, You Are My Sunshine and Jesus Loves Me, into the second movement. The third movement is based around the fiddle tune Big John McNeil, which in Manitoba is sometimes also known as the Métis anthem. And this was a tune she loved and would have heard and danced to at the family farm. Here is an excerpt from English Horn Concerto in memory of Beverly Klusten. It was commissioned and premiered by the Montreal Metropolitan Orchestra in 2019. You will hear the end of the second movement and the beginning of the third movement. Last year, during the pandemic, I wrote another piece about my Aunt Beverly, but this time it was focused on the relationship between her and my mum. When Naomi Wu asked me to write a solo piano piece for her in the concert she was doing for Virtuosi Concerts in Winnipeg, she gave me the theme of home. I have written many pieces about Manitoba's big skies, the wind, the grasslands, the northern lights, and the cold, crisp Manitoba winters. But as I consulted with my mom and read some of her recent work on her book, I realized that home is also about deep relationships and deep connections. The title of this solo piano piece, Our Inner Lives Were Entwined, Embroidered with the Same Pattern, is a quote from the book my mom is writing, and the larger passage from which I chose the title is as follows, quote, "Much of my life had been influenced by my closeness to Beverly, my relationship with my children, my career. My academic research critiqued Western public policy, historically separating the most vulnerable from their families and communities. I explored the values of our mother's family that were rooted in Indigenous traditional knowledge, where individuals like Beverly were viewed as teachers, bringing spiritual gifts to those close to and caring for them. In the first year after Bev's death, I felt raw, and in the 3 years since, unquiet. I wanted to find a way to express what she'd meant to me beyond and beneath the words of research and publications. In the years during her imprisonment, and especially in the months and first years of her recovery from the institution, we'd had troubling struggles, disagreements, and even shouting matches. But we kept reaching for each other, and this brought us closer. Every once in a while, Beverly turned to me and said, 'You're my sister. I love you, Joycey.' And then she'd place her head gently on my shoulder. I felt the same way about her. I've heard the expression that people can be cut from the same cloth, and that was certainly true of our physical appearance. But I believe our inner lives were entwined somehow, as if embroidered with the same patterns, and we recognized these patterns in each other." End quote. My mom describes so beautifully what I saw and what I experienced in our home. So to explore the interconnectedness of my aunt and my mom in music, I developed motives from the letters of their names and their nicknames, Bevy and Joycey. And during the faster sections, the Beverly pitch collections are in the left hand, with the Joyce pitch collections in the right. Through transpositions and transformations of the pitch material, I am depicting the ups and downs of their lives, their relationship with each other, and their relationships with those around them. Beverly was an amazing aunt who had a zeal for life, an ability to state the uncomfortable truth, and she loved deeply. This performance is from the online premiere in March 2021 and is a short excerpt from the beginning. So although there is no text in the piece, the title and structure reflects the close relationship my mom and her sister had, and the ways I and my siblings experienced the love from them and their relationship. In conclusion, exploring my grandmother's story, my great-great-grandmother's story, and my mother and aunt's story has opened my eyes to the complicated relationships my family and I have with our multicultural heritage. We live in the intersection of settler and Indigenous values. My grandmother and aunt often had to fight to get their voices heard, and they were sometimes angry. I am sometimes angry at the injustices I learn about and encounter, but I am also in a place of privilege, and I have to fight my own racism that can sometimes be hard to see, and that is in my blood. My mother and I continue to work together, although we are starting to move deeper into our heritage, looking at our connections to Cree communities and to explore our own relationships with other settlers in Manitoba, including the Mennonites. Because of the work and encouragement of my grandmother, I know who I am and my place in Canada's history. I am grateful to her for teaching me to be proud of my heritage. Because of my mixed heritage, I have benefited from colonialism, and I have been wounded by colonialism. But it is through my music that I have found my voice, that I've healed my wounds, and where I continue to explore the complicated relationships of my past and present.